Alrighty, it's 3:05, so I think we're gonna get started. So welcome back. Hope you guys had a nice lunch. This is going to be our very last content-filled lecture for WebLab, so that's really exciting. With that said, let's jump right into it. So today's class is on deployment, and the question is, you've made this project, right? You worked on this website for a long time, and you have this really cool tool, but now what? What are you going to do? Well, you want to be able to share it with the world, right? You want your tool to be able to be accessible by everyone out there who wants to use it. So that's why we do deployment. We need to deploy our website so that we can share it with other people. If someone wanted to use your website before you deployed, they would have to go to your GitHub. They would have to git clone, npm run start, npm run hotloader in order to see your tools. That's, I think, a little bit convoluted for most people to be able to access your website. You want to give them a really nice way to do that. So we're going to deploy. We're going to make our web app easily accessible to the world. And really what deploying is, conceptually at a high level, is we're just getting some other process to run our server.js. So basically, you can kind of think of it as there's this machine out there somewhere that's running server.js. It's doing npm run start. It would be nice if we could just npm run start on our computer and just have it running. But there's problems with that. Our computer is going to run out of battery, and the server is going to die. Our computer is going to lose connection to the internet. So you want it to be running somewhere where it's consistently available for clients to connect to. And now anytime wants to access your website, they can visit the URL that you assigned for your client. So instead of going to localhost 5000, they would go to the URL that you assigned when you deployed. All right, sweet. So that's just a really quick high-level overview of what deploying is. And for the rest of today, we are going to be doing a walkthrough of what deploying is like practically. So together, we're going to deploy Capbook React onto a website. You should try to follow along if you can. With Capbook React, you'll be able to do most of the things that I'm going to do today, except for one very small step. If you're feeling ambitious, maybe you can try following along with your skeleton code, right, with your actual project repository, and that way it'll be deployed already. And we're just going to deploy our website together. One quick note is I'm not going to be doing it live. It's going to be screenshots in the slides. And the reason for that is because I find it pretty hard to imagine that you're just going to remember this, all of this stuff by yourself. So it'll be here for reference. When you're actually deploying your website, come back to these slides, walk through the steps, and just do it for your actual website. Deploying is going to fail a lot of the time. If you look at this meme, 60% of the time, it works every time, which is very true. It's not going to work your first time. I can almost guarantee that. So you want to be able to deploy long before your website is due and have a lot of time to debug. So let's try deploying. Let's get started. We're going to be using a service called Heroku. So some of you might have seen Heroku already. Most of you probably. What Heroku basically is it's a hosting platform, a website hosting platform. So it's going to allow us to host our websites. It's going to generally give you a URL of this format. So whatever you named your app here, and then .herokuapp.com. So if you go to that URL, you'll be able to see your website working. And if you want to see Capbook working right now on Heroku, feel free to visit this link. We've deployed a version of Capbook here. Cool. So let's deploy Capbook ourselves. So what we're going to do is go to heroku.com. And You should have an account already. You should have made one in one of the homeworks from the first week, but if you don't have an account, make one real quick and it'll take you to this dashboard. From there, you're going to click New on the top right corner, Create New App. And that's going to take you to a page like this. So what you've basically done is you've instantiated this new application that Heroku is going to host. What you need to do is you need to give it a name. So I just named it this, but you can name it whatever you want. Maybe like catbook-react-your curve or something. Note that it has to be a unique application name because Heroku, again, is hosting your website at yourapp.herokuapp.com, right? So if you named it the same as another app, it wouldn't know which one to host when you visited the website. So you're gonna have to name it something unique. And let's click Create App. That's going to take you to a page like this. So we have instantiated this application on Heroku, and we're going to want to deploy it. So if we go to this Deploy tab over here on the top, we're going to see a page that looks like this, and we're going to have to click this button here, Connect to GitHub. So what that's doing is it's telling Heroku, hey, I have this website that exists on GitHub. I want you to go link up with that code over there and just run it and host it. So now your website, which is living on GitHub, Heroku can just read it directly from there and host it itself. All right. Can I just make sure that people are following along so far? Can you just send a quick thumbs up, React, if you're caught up, if everything is making sense? Okay, sweet. Cool, looks good. If this is not making sense, that's totally fine. I think a lot of things are not going to make sense the first time that you walk through them. The first time that we go through it, it's going to be new, right? But that's why there's slides. That's why there's recordings. Just watch it over again when you're going to deploy, and that should help out a lot. All right, let's keep running with this. So after we click Connect to GitHub, if we scroll down, we're going to connect to our WebLab workshops organization. That's where Catbook React exists. And then once you do that, we're going to search for Catbook React and we're going to connect to it. At this step, if you're deploying your actual application, instead of choosing WebLab workshops, you're going to click WebLab-class and then search for the name of your repository there and connect it there instead. All right, and then once we find that, we're going to connect and we're going to click deploy. So what this is going to do is it's going to tell Heroku, hey, I've linked up my app. You can see all the code that you need. Deploy it. Host it at myappname.heroku.com. I want to be able to visit it on the website. So let's click deploy, and it'll take a few seconds, maybe 30 seconds or so. But eventually you'll get to this page. It'll say, receive code from GitHub, and then deploy to Heroku is a success. Alrighty, deployed, right? That was really fast, 10 minutes, and our website is up and running. So why is this a 1-hour lecture? It turns out that deploying is not that easy. So let's actually click on this view button that it gave us, right? So if we click view down here, it's going to open up our application website. And we're going to see that it actually doesn't contain what we want it to contain. It's going to say application error. That's bad. Our website is not meant to be a blank page that says application error. It's supposed to do a lot of cool things. So something went wrong here. Let's try to figure it out. So if we go back to our deploy page for our app, we're going to see that there's this option up here for viewing logs. So whenever you run into an error when you're running your code locally, like npm run start, npm run hotloader, and something goes wrong with your website page, all your console.logs, all of the things that like could have gone wrong, that's going to show up in your terminal, right? Your terminal is going to probably have some sort of error message like package not found or variable not defined or missing close bracket or something. So those logs from our command line, from our terminal, are going to show up in these logs up here in Heroku. So this is kind of like the output, the logs of running your code. So let's click that and see what's up. So we have all of these logs, just some meta information. And if we zoom in on this section here, we see this line. It says server running on port 3000, and then error, web process failed to bind to port. Okay, what's going on here? Well, if you remember in the code, we had port equals 3000. And that way, whenever we ran our server, it would run on the port localhost 3000. But Heroku is not as obedient as our computer. So we can tell our computer, hey, use port 3000, use port 3000, and your computer is going to be like, okay, yeah, we can use port 3000. But Heroku is going to force a port that your website then has to use. So you can't force Heroku to use port 3000. You're going to have to listen to what Heroku tells you. Heroku is going to tell you, I want to use this port number. And the way it tells you that is it tells you that in this variable right here called process.m.port. So instead of forcing it to listen to port 3000, we have to listen to what Heroku tells us to listen to. And what's going on here is Heroku is basically telling us, hey, I have this thing called .env, or env is short for environment. And I'm going to put some values in there that you're going to need to know about, including this port number. Okay. So for the server, for what host it's running on, it's not always going to be on 3000. It's going to be on whatever port I put in this env variable, this env object. And then you can access it by looking at the port field. So the way to get around it is we can replace our code. In the code, it says const port equals 3000. We can just replace it to this. That's basically going to say, hey, is there a port that Heroku is telling us to run on? If so, we're going to use that. If not, or otherwise, we're going to default to 3000. If your app has not finished building yet, that's fine. Just give it some time. Just keep following along. All right, let's talk more about this env thing. Let's talk more about what it is. So if we go here, let's understand what process.env is. So if we just recap, our app consists of a front end and a back end, right? So the front end, all of this React stuff is going on. It's rendering our website, and then it's calling things from the back end, from the server. So whenever you need to log in, whenever you need to access data from your database, you're going to talk to the server. And the server then is going to reach out to these helper sort of things that exist, like the database for retrieving and storing data, or Google Auth for handling login. Process.env, I like to think of it as another thing that the server, the backend, can talk to. So it's one of those things that the backend can talk to and ask for information. And all it does is it stores some specific variable values, including the port. So to say that another way, process.env is this global variable that our backend can access. We're going to store a lot of values in the process.env, such as port. But also, in addition to port, we're also going to store some other things like sensitive info. And we'll explain why that is in just a bit. But just remember, process.env is this object. It's this global variable that our backend can talk to. It's going to be how our website determines what port to run on. And it's also going to hold some sensitive info for our website. And the reason we want to hide sensitive info in .env is because we don't want other people to be able to see it. So we want to put it in this safe, secure location that only our backend can talk to. All right, so if we remember in our code, we had this one section where we defined Mongo connection URL, and it was this big string that had some sensitive info, right? Like it had our password for a user. So anyone who had this string could theoretically modify our database. So we need to hide this from our code. We're going to put it in process.env. So let's make one. Let's make a process.env file. If you open up your VS Code to the Catbook React folder, we're going to make a file called .env and make sure that it's going to be in your project's outermost folder. So not inside server, not inside node modules, not inside client. It's in the same level as package lock, as Babel, etc. And we're just going to type in the name .env. All right, and now we're going to add it to our git ignore. So git ignore, I think it's been briefly mentioned before, but just to recap on what it is, it's a set of files and folder names that Git will kind of ignore, right? It's just going to not think about those when doing your git adds, git commits, etc. So in this way, GitHub is not going to be able to track this sensitive info that you put in .env. So again, .env is this object that contains a lot of sensitive info for your backend. And we're not going to allow GitHub to see it. So we're going to put in the git ignore. The way to do that is we open up git ignore. And in addition to the stuff that we don't want GitHub to see, we're also going to include .env. All right, so far so good. The next step is we actually need to put our info in process.env, right? So we made .env. We need to put the information in there that is sensitive. So let's do that. Let's put in Atlas SRV, which is our Mongo connection URL. We're just going to name it something different, but we're going to move that in here. And we're going to also move session secret, which is something that's sensitive in here as well. So copy over your Mongo connection URL, copy over your session secret into your .env file. These are things, again, that we don't want to put on GitHub in case our project becomes open source. We don't want other people to be able to see this stuff because then they could directly mess with our database. All right, so once you've put your secret information in there, it's gonna be stored there, so we don't need it in our code anymore. We'll get to that later, but just make sure that this information is here. Also, quick note, everyone who's working on the project has to have their own .env file. And the reason is because it's not being put on GitHub in any way, right? So if you guys both want to be able to access this information, you both need to have your own local copies because you can't share it. It's not going on GitHub. It's not being shared. All right, the last step is we have to install some packages in order to access our .env file. So let's install .env by going to the command line, typing npm install .env. And then in order to import the package, we're going to have to require it at the top of server.js. So at the first line or second line of server.js, put this code, require .env.config. And now it's been initialized. We've installed the .env package and we have our .env file. So we can use process.env.variable name wherever we want to use one of those variables that are in .env. Cool, let's see how that works. So in our code before, right, we had Mongo connection URL equals string. We also had session secret over here, hard-coded. These are sensitive pieces of information we don't want GitHub to be able to see. We don't want other people to just be able to see this by opening up our GitHub. So we're going to move them to the env file. So now they exist in the env file under the variable names Atlas SRV and session secret. So instead, we want our code to look something like this. Mongo connection URL equals, and then process.env.atlassrv. What this is doing is it's fetching this process.env object that exists, and it's looking for the variable Atlas SRV and replacing the value of this with that variable. Same with session secret. Okay, so just to go back, it used to look like this with Mongo connection URL equals string and secret is some string. That's sensitive info, we're moving it to the .env, and now we can replace it with this. So now if anyone looks at our GitHub and sees this information, they're not going to know what that Mongo connection URL is, and they're not going to know what our session secret is. This is key for deployment because once you deploy your GitHub, oftentimes you want to make it open source so other people can see it. You want to hide things in process.env. Okay, so we made those two changes. And then just a quick reminder, we were also supposed to make this change. So in server.js, we defined const port equals 3000. We don't want that. Instead, we want process.env.port or 3000. Again, what this is doing is when we're on Heroku, Heroku is going to assign this a value. It's going to modify .env. You can kind of think of it as modifying .env and putting in this port value that we want to use instead of just the hard-coded 3000 value. So those are just the small changes that we need to make. And once we do that, for your actual project, what you would do is you would commit all of your changes, push them, and then we would have to go to Heroku and redeploy. So unfortunately, if you're following along in the Capbook React, so if you're following along in your skeleton code, like your real project, you should do this and just do that. But if you're following along with the Capbook React folder, unfortunately, we don't give you guys edit permissions for that repo. So instead, what you can do is just check out the deploy branch because we just made a custom branch for deploying so that we could see how this worked. And if we redeploy with the deploy branch instead on Capbook React, that should work as well. So either you're following along with your own skeleton code, right? Your own project repository, or you're following along with Kappa React, and then just follow the appropriate steps. Okay, so I'm going to be redeploying the Kappa React repository. So I'm going to switch the branch to deploy, and I'm going to click deploy branch. All right, so the question is this going to work? So what we've done is we've hidden sensitive information into this process.env, and simultaneously, we've given Heroku a way to communicate what port it wants us to run on. So process.env is serving two things here. It's giving us a way to store sensitive info, and it's also giving Heroku a way of telling us what port to run on. So when we redeploy and give it a second to run and open our app again, it's going to fail again, unfortunately. So it's actually not going to work. The reason is because we've made this .env file locally, but we never pushed it to the GitHub, right? We never pushed it to the GitHub because it's in our git ignore. So Heroku still doesn't know what the value of process.env.atlas_srv is. It doesn't know what the value of process.env.session_secret is. So we need to tell Heroku that, hey, Heroku, you know, on GitHub, there are these secret values that we don't want other people to be able to know, but you need to know it since you're running our website for us. So we need to tell Heroku what those values are. And we're going to do that through config vars. So recap, Heroku does not actually have access to our env files. We need to tell Heroku what they are through Heroku's config variables. This is basically Heroku's version of a env file, .env file. So we have a local version of .env for running code locally. GitHub is kind of the man in the middle who doesn't know what's going on. And then Heroku on the other side, we're going to directly tell it, hey, these are the values in config vars. So if we go back to our app page, we were previously on deploy. Let's move over to settings. So let's click on the settings tab and scroll down a little bit. We're going to see this button here for reveal config vars. So let's click on that. And it's going to open up this sort of menu here. And here we're going to enter the key value pairs. So key is going to be basically the variable name in our process.env. Value is going to be the value of that variable name. And the nice thing here is we actually don't need quotes around the Mongo string, so we should copy it without the quotes. So let's do that. We have two variables in our .env. One is atlas_srv, one is session secret. So we're going to put those in as the key names and copy over their respective values into the value section. Give you guys a second to do that. All right, hopefully that's done. It should save automatically once you add them. So now, to summarize, we've just communicated to Heroku that we have these values by putting them in the config vars. So now Heroku knows that atlas_srv is this value, session secret is this value. So .env is your local version, right? It's the local file that you use to run your code and keep sensitive information private. Config vars is the Heroku version. So one of them is your local version, one of them is your Heroku version. All right, so after we're done with that, after we've set the config vars, let's go back and redeploy one more time. So this time, everything knows about everything, right? Our local code knows about the secret values. Our Heroku code also knows about the secret values. So should be able to work. Let's click deploy one more time. And Did that work? Well, let's give it a second to redeploy. Hopefully, after that's run, you should see something like this. So your site should actually work. You should be able to see some sensible code on your site. So let's give everyone a few minutes to just catch up to this point. This is going to be the end of like the follow along section. You're not going to be able to follow for the next step, but let's just give everyone a chance to catch up to where we are. Use the help queue. Staff is going to come help you. If you have any questions that you think would apply to everyone, put them on the questions doc. All right, looks like people are doing okay. So let's move on. So you should get something like this. You have a site that like kind of renders and it works for the most part. But there's one less problem. And that problem is when you click login with Google Auth, it's going to give you this pop-up that says redirect URL mismatch. This might look familiar if you tried following through with the lecture on auth and authentication on Monday, but let's quickly recap what's going on here. So when we set up our website auth with Google, we had to allow localhost 5000 to be a valid website. So that way, Google would know that any requests sent from localhost 5000 are good and not dangerous. And it turns out that we need to do the same thing for when we deploy, right? So when we deploy our site to this appname.herokuapp.com and we try to click the login button, Google is getting this request from a website that it does not recognize. So we need to tell Google, hey, this website's actually okay. Please allow the login request to go through. And the code for doing that, the sort of guide for doing that is here on weblab.2/client ID. If you did that the first time, let's continue and head over to console.developers.google.com. All right, so once we're here, we're going to look at our project name, which is test deploy in my case, but you probably named it something else. And we're going to click on credentials. And in this part down here, if you remember, we created an OAuth 2.0 client ID for our website. That was the Google client ID that we copied over into our code. So if we edit that, we're going to see that originally it only was allowing localhost 5,000 to go through. And we just need to add another valid URL for it to work. So in my case, that would be test deploy xd.herokuapp.com, but in your case, it'll be whatever you just named your Heroku app. So let's add that URL and put it in there and save. And once we do that, Google is going to know, hey, I get a login request from this Heroku app domain. It's valid, actually. I see it, I recognize it, I'm gonna let it through. So after that final step, you should basically have your website deployed. It should be working. It should be working online. Everyone should be able to access it. No one needs to clone your GitHub repository and do all the npm run start nonsense. So hopefully that works. Deploying is really a tricky thing because it's really hard to debug. And sometimes you'll need to just do it multiple times for it to work. So we recommend strongly that you guys try deploying your websites a long time before the milestones are actually due, just so you have that buffer time. And also, come to office hours and the hackathon tonight to try to deploy it. Let's just do a quick recap at the very end of all of the steps that we had to implement in order to deploy our website. So first, we had to go to Heroku and link it to our GitHub. Then we had to create this .env file and add it to the git ignore because it contains sensitive information that GitHub should not know about. From there, we started modifying variables in our code from their original value to the value that might be dictated by process.env. So the port number should not just be hard-coded to 3000. We need to give Heroku app an option of telling us what port to run on instead. And we also need to move our sensitive data, such as the Mongo connection string, as well as the session secret, into the .env file. Process.env is this big object that we can call from the backend in order to access these secret variable names. And so once we've moved all of that into the .env file, we also need to make sure Heroku knows about it by putting it in the config bars. And finally, we need to tell Google Auth to allow logins from our new website address. After all of that's done, it's a lot of steps, but after you finish all of that, you can go ahead and click deploy, and your website should be online and available for everyone to see. So, if you made a website by following along, you can share it with your friends. They should be able to just open it up and see like the page of Catbook, or if you deployed your own personal site, congrats, you already have it deployed. There's going to be a lot of errors because deploying is tricky. So if you run into those, just add yourself to the help queue or come talk to us, make a Piazza post. But if you follow these steps exactly, you really should not run into any problems. Cool. Hope that makes sense and you guys have your websites deployed. I'll turn it over to Shannon and Nick for send off when they're ready.